Gengar Gang, what is going on? My name is Ryan, this is the Analytic Gengar, and welcome to another TCG ToolKit video. In today's video, we're going to be talking about a collector's guide to Pokemon card centering. Everything you need to know about how to take measurements, understand the common jargon, as well as a comprehensive review of both BGS and PSA grading standards. So friends, welcome to today's video. A quick aside prior to us starting this video is this video is mainly inspired by a lot of the pack opening channels that I've seen. It seems like there's now, obviously, a shift in focus to the importance of good centering, because good centering usually means a good grade, especially when a card is packed fresh. That said, I wanted to make a video that addressed some of the major points about centering and how you, as an individual, could also reliably take measurements and understand some of the more technical aspects of centering before getting into the hobby yourself. So, if you are looking at Pokemon card collecting as well as other trading card games, know that this video is for you. So if you have entered from a different space but you found this video, definitely feel free to keep watching. A lot of the main concepts will apply, even if the examples that I'm showing on screen do not. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Now, this video will be broken up into 4 parts, but before we get into the 4 main parts, I did want to take a moment to define centering. Centering is going to be defined for the sake of this conversation and video as the position of the main image of the card relative to the borders of the card. For Pokemon, it's going to be the yellow border on the front and the blue border at the edge of the card on the back. The main image in this particular Gold Star card is everything that is inside of that yellow border. So, we're talking about the position of that main image and where it sits on the card, and more importantly, we're talking about how much of the area is left just as a border. Now, moving on to part 1 of the video, we'll first go ahead and take a quick look at calculating centering and understanding what types of measurements there are. So, to briefly go over that, the first thing we need to do is understand proportions, because centering is based entirely off of proportions. Proportions are a part, share, or a number considered in comparative relation to the whole. So recall just a moment ago I said that we were looking at the borders of the card and trying to identify how much and where the main image sits on those borders. So in this particular case, the proportion is going to be how much of the border is on the left of the card and on the right of the card, or on the top of the card and on the bottom of the card. Mostly, and very rarely, you will see some people try to articulate centering in terms of top left or bottom right, or some combination of the different sides, but typically it's always going to be the opposite ends of the cards that are being compared. Whenever people compare 2 of the sides that are next to each other, it's typically because they are trying to use a little bit more advanced methodology in order to determine its horizontal or its dimensional centering. Now, those are a bit beyond the scope of this video, and they realistically don't play much a factor in centering standards based on PSA and BGS, so we're going to go ahead and disregard them for the main components of today's video. Now, when we're looking at any Pokemon card, take for example this shiny Charizard out of Hidden Fates, you'll see that the main image is obviously Charizard, and there is a black line that circles Charizard. That is the main image of the card. Everything inside that black line. Everything outside of that black line is considered a border. So as you can see here, we have the border from the left and then the right, and then we have the border at the top and then the bottom. Now, mainly, you'll see that cards pretty neatly fall within their border, and occasionally what Pokemon has done to further add complexity to the design of the card is let the Pokemon come out of the border. So in a case like Charizard, you'll see that one of his feet crosses into the border, as well as that wing that also sits pretty significantly outside the border of the card. But in almost all instances, cards will look and behave the same way, even if over time the rarity of certain cards has changed. Now, when it comes to centering, the way that centering is typically stated is as a proportion. So here we see the most basic type of centering, 60:40. What does this mean? Well, it means that 60% of the border is on the first part of the card, and then 40% of the border is on the other half of the card. Now notice that I didn't say top, bottom, left, right, because as we're looking at this number alone, we don't have enough information to make that judgment. We can assume, and we can kind of use context clues based on a conversation or an image to figure out what that proportion is in relation to. However, just like this, we can't actually make that determination. Now, in order to further specify, whenever you're reading a measurement, typically what will happen is you will be told top to bottom or left to right. And this way, it's not up to guess. We'll cover this a little bit later on, but just know that typically you won't just see this number. And if you do just see numbers, know that it applies to either the top, bottom, left, right, or front, back. And typically, again, the grading standards, as well as most folks, will be pretty clear about explaining what proportions apply to which sides of the card. Now, with that said, the other key thing to notice is that I just said percentages. So 60% to 40%, not 60 units of measurement to 40 units of measurement. The reason for that is because these aren't actually measurements. These are proportions like we've been speaking about. But if you wanted to see a more mathematical example of how something like this would play out, let's take a look at this example where I hypothetically took measurements of 6 millimeters on the left and 9 millimeters on the right. As you can see, these now come with a clearly defined unit of measurement. And for the most part, we'll either be dealing in pixels and millimeters because there isn't usually a Pokemon card that has borders that range in the inches, and centimeters are usually too large to get a reliable measurement from. Now, in order to calculate the proportions, in order to turn this measurement into the 60/40 or its equivalent, we're going to need to do a little bit of math. As we had mentioned, proportions are in comparison to a whole. So the first thing we'll need to do is take the two components, the 6 and the 9, and add them up. We arrive at the number 15, which indicates the total amount of border in relation to the two sides that we're currently comparing. From here, we're going to go ahead and calculate the percentage by dividing the individual by the whole and multiplying it by 100. This is the basic math formula in order to convert any measurements for centering into a proportion. So let's walk through an example together. We take the 6 millimeters that we had over on the left-hand side and divide it by the whole 15. We will then get to a number 0.4 and multiply that by 100 in order to get 40%. We'll do the same thing down at the bottom for the 9, so divide it by 15 and it comes out to 0.6, and then multiply that by 100 to get to 60%. And wouldn't you know it, the 6 by 9 millimeter measurement is actually a proportional centering of 60/40, just like the example we were previously looking at. So with that in mind, do bear in mind the key takeaways are that units of measurements are critical, but don't forget that for the most part, everything that is spoken about in regards to centering will be in terms of proportions, and that means you'll need to be able to either quickly convert the stuff or have a calculator handy that can allow you to do this type of math on a quick and easy notice. Next up, we have the section on understanding measurements. So you now know the mathematical formulas on how the measurements turn into proportions, and now let's walk through a couple examples. So in order to do that, let's first take a look back at this 60/40 number. As was previously stated, this number was probably converted from a measurement of 6 by 9 millimeters, and we now know that the card is centered 60/40. As we previously mentioned, what does that really mean? Is it top to bottom, left to right, on the front, or on the back? Well, typically your measurements will come with some additional information, either in the front or the back, that will allow you to make those determinations. So the first thing to note is that typically you'll be told TB or LR, or top bottom or left right. All this means is that the opposite sides of the card are being compared, and this is the ratio that they sit within. Again, it's very easy and very complex to get into a situation where you're taking measurements and all this sort of crazy stuff is going on, but it's a lot simpler to speak in terms of proportions because everybody can understand 60/40. Not everyone is going to intuitively know that 6 millimeters by 9 millimeters is actually a 60/40 proportional measurement. So it's a lot easier to simply speak in terms of the proportions, and then the top, bottom, or left, right help you to know which sides you're actually speaking about. In addition to that, you'll typically also be given some additional information in the form of a front or back or F or B. And that basically tells you which side of the card we're speaking about, as well as which sides of the card we're speaking about. So, in addition to the terms that we've already covered, I did want to introduce another one to this conversation. I don't know that it's actually a real term, but I'm introducing it because it's something that I frequently refer to. And what that is skew. We're going to go ahead and define skew as the higher number minus the lower number mathematically, and in words, it's going to be the amount of shift in any direction. So from the perfectly centered 50/50, if we took our 60/40 example, the difference would be 60 minus 40 equals 20. And this means that the card can be shifted in any direction by an amount of 20%. Now, that doesn't mean the card can be shifted one way 20%, because 50 minus another 20% would actually be 30. All this means is that that is the total amount of room that is given. And if you want some mathematical proof that this is actually a valid concept, take a look at a perfectly centered 50/50 card. 50% of the border on the left and 50% border on the right. What this means is that there is a skew of 0, meaning the card cannot move much in any direction. So that is what skew is. It's important because that higher number in the skew formula, or just the higher number in general, will typically be a quick indicator of where you're looking in terms of grading standards. Because it doesn't matter, for example, if you had 60 and then 40, and then you had another one that was 55/45. Realistically, the highest number, the 60, will actually be the one that influences whether or not you're going to get a PSA 10 or a PSA 9 or a BGS 9.5 or 9, etc., etc. So it is important to keep those types of numbers in mind because they will serve as a very quick and easy indicator to help you understand what it is your card may be grading for. Next up is taking measurements in part 3 of this video. Now, measurements will, in my head, be broken up into 2 logical components, the online section as well as the in-person or physical section. So, when it comes to the online section, you'll typically see cards with high quality photos. One of the ways you can choose to go ahead and take a photo and measure it is by counting pixels. So if a photograph is high quality enough, it will have many pixels, meaning you can zoom in on the border of a card and you can actually physically count out the number of pixels from the edge of the main image all the way out to the end of the card. Because of the way proportions work, this is actually a mathematically valid way to take a measurement, determine a proportion, and determine the final centering on the card. Now, a pro of this method is that you don't have to have the card in person, and more importantly, this means you don't have to be limited and you can expand your shoppability over to the online realm. However, it's bad if you have a low quality image, or if because of a low quality image you take a measurement that isn't actually valid and therefore actually causes you to mismeasure your card. For example, you may think your card is 60/40 and therefore within PSA 10's centering criteria. However, what may end up happening is because of the low quality image, you may have actually mistakenly counted it out as 60/40 when it was 65/35 and therefore a PSA 9. That can be a costly mistake, and for some people, especially high-end investors, it may cause some issues down the road. Secondly, you can actually take a ruler and throw it on your computer. Now, I don't recommend this method, but theoretically, it works exactly as I've described. Because of the way proportions work, you can scale an image larger or smaller, but as long as you maintain its aspect ratio, realistically, the proportions are still the same. What does this mean? This means you can literally take a ruler, slap it on your computer surface, and measure out the different borders and then determine centering. A couple of notes about rulers. I don't like them, and personally they are not an accurate way to measure anything that isn't several centimeters or several inches in length. The reason for this is because rulers can actually have a slight margin of error, and overall the print quality isn't always guaranteed, especially on dollar store rulers or the more cheaply built ones. As a result, it's usually better to deal in a device that can measure in millimeters or pixels or anything smaller and more significant, and although this method could work in a pinch, I don't always recommend you depend on this solely to help determine centering. Finally, as a last online method, you could print out your Pokemon cards and measure them. Again, the only trick with this method is that you do have to maintain the aspect ratio. So if you wanted to, you could blow this picture up. The only thing is that both the width and the height of the image need to be scaled the exact same way. So if you're going to double the width, you better double the height. And by doing so, you'll actually be able to maintain the aspect ratio and the proportions of the card will remain exactly the same. Therefore, you can take a ruler and go ahead and measure that and actually determine the proportions within reasonable measure. Now bear in mind, again, just like the previous method, this isn't perfect, and because it does have a ruler involved with it in my example, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as the most reliable method. Next up, we'll briefly discuss the physical elements to measuring. Now, physical is actually a lot different because you will have the card directly in front of you, and what this means is that you will have a little bit more control over what it is you're measuring. As I'd mentioned, the first of the recommended methods is the ruler measurement. Again, this is probably my least favorite just because rulers do not have meaningful increments for measurements on cards. Pokemon cards and most trading cards are only a couple inches in length and width anyway, meaning that if we wanted to get really accurate measurements, we want to be down to the millimeters. And this way we'll be able to very quickly and very reliably measure the trading card's borders. However, in a pinch, it will work. The idea remains the same. Take your measurements, walk through the math like we did in the first section of this video, and you should be able to determine within reasonable doubt a proportion for centering on the top or bottom or left or right of a Pokemon card. Next up, during the research of this video, I actually found out about something called a grade master, as you can see on screen right now. A grade master is pretty cool because it is a device made by someone who's big into the baseball trading card game hobby. And what's amazing is that he was able, because he's a mechanical engineer probably, to craft a really cool see-through sleeve of some sort. And as you can see on screen right now, it's really cool because you just square the card up on it and magically it will allow you to take measurements in proportions. And as a result, you'll then be able to use this little key that he's prepared in order to take those numbers, square them up, and find out what the proportions are. And as you can see, each of them is in proportion language, not in measurement language. So this is actually pretty cool because assuming it's working and assuming that it is a valid method, this is actually a pretty cool device. Now, it should be said, I don't own this item. No one is telling me to say anything about this item. However, I did purchase this item after learning about it. And what I plan to do is, with my own money, I've purchased it, it'll arrive at my home, and then I'm actually going to go ahead and review it. So I'm going to learn how to use it, I'm going to take a couple measurements, I'm going to use other methods to measure and see how they compare. And the hope is that I'll be able to then make a video about it, probably a TCG ToolKit video, where I review this item and let you all know if it is any good. So bear in mind that while I wasn't able to necessarily review this item myself, I did see a lot of positive comments about it, so I did think that it would be a pretty good way to mention something that is not just taking a ruler up to the card. Speaking of taking rulers up to the card, the third method, and the method that I have both the most experience with as well as the most knowledge of, is actually using a capillere. So a capillere is this really cool device that you're seeing on screen right now. Basically, the way it works is it has a pair of jaws, and that LCD screen displays the distance between the two jaws at any given point. Here's a Magikarp that we're going to use for the sake of this demonstration, and what you're going to see now is that it's a really cool and simple device. When you turn it on, you'll be able to see the measurement. You can turn it on and off, and then you actually have a button to switch between millimeter and inches. Inches is kind of useless to us, but millimeters is where we want to be at. As you can see now, I'm moving the jaws apart, and as I do, the display reads out the exact measurement, this in inches, now in millimeters. As you can see, you can basically take this to the surface of the card, align the centers perfectly well, and get a pretty decent measurement, and it's going to be mathematically accurate. Now, if needed, and this was a really rare card, you could put a sleeve or a card saver over it. It doesn't matter. As long as it's transparent, you'll be able to do this process and go ahead and get a pretty solid measurement. As you can see, I ended up at 2.5 millimeters, which I personally think is a pretty decent measurement. On the other side, I'm going to go ahead and repeat that process. It looks like I end up at about 2.8. I think my hand moved the capillary just a little bit, so it did go down from 2.8 to 2.7, but you get the general process. There's also this top section which measures the distance apart from the opposite end. Personally, I believe this side is the only side that's relevant to us as collectors, but you may also find a use for this in your home. A lot of folks in other hobbies also find this useful for other stuff. Now, there is a link below to go ahead and purchase this item on Amazon. So if you are interested, definitely feel free to check that link out below. In full transparency, I am using an Amazon affiliates link. So at no additional cost to you, should you go through, click on that link and purchase this item, the channel will actually receive a small percentage back from Amazon in support of directing you to that link. Do bear in mind, I bought this item with my own money. I use this item in the hobby all the time, so I'm only recommending stuff that I 100% know about and 100% recommend. So with that said, it would mean a lot if you could support the link. If not, feel free to check out other ones. I use this one, so I know it and I trust it, which is why I also threw the link down below. Now, with that said, let's go ahead and briefly get into grading standards, part 4 of this video. And fair warning, this is probably where the most subjective parts of my commentary are going to come into play, because up till now, everything kind of has been a science. But now we're going to get into a little bit of the subjectivity / commentary. So make sure I will do my best to make sure that that is relatively clear to you as we kind of peg through the video. As you can see on this nifty chart on screen right now, you have comparisons of the BGS grades over on the left hand side, so Beckett, and then the right hand side has PSA, Professional Sports Authenticators. As you can see, the BGS 10 grade is actually not on screen, and that is because to get a Beckett 10, it needs to be 50-50 top bottom and left right. You'll typically see that noted as minimum 50-50, and that means there's no margin for error on centering. Fun fact, Beckett is notoriously difficult for their centering, and PSA is notoriously difficult on the corners of the cards. So if you're ever curious about who is tougher on what, there's a general guide. In my experience, that's what I've found. Now, let's briefly go through this. For a PSA 10, which I think everybody has at least heard of, there's, believe it or not, a significant margin for error. 60-40 is the maximum that a card can be skewed on the front in order to receive a PSA 10. So that means that a card can actually be shifted by that much in any one direction and still receive a Gem Mint 10, assuming all the other criteria are met. Note that the back of the card must be centered 75-25. So right here, I'd like to just pause and kind of point out that whenever you see people opening packs and whenever you see cards being assessed for their centering, do remember that these are the standards. So 60-40 does mean there can be a little bit of off-centering for a PSA 10, and on the back of the card, it can actually be hilariously skewed and still receive the perfect score. So as a quick aside, let's take a look at some examples of some PSA 10 cards. As you can see here, this isn't a Pokemon card, but it does illustrate the concept of skew pretty well. So here we have a card that is skewed 45-55 left to right. That means 45% on the left, 55 on the right. And as you can see, to the untrained eye, there's not much to see here. The more you look at it, the more you'll tend to see, but at first glance, it looks like a perfectly centered card. For this reason, I kind of see why PSA would allow a card like this in as a PSA 10 because honestly, there's not really much wrong with it unless you're starting to scrutinize it. And a Gem Mint 10, by the way, is defined as perfect, but with a little bit of wiggle room. Now, here's another example, this one of a 40-60. Here you can see 40% border on the left, 60% on the right. This is a little bit more noticeable, and it's about as noticeable as it's going to get without docking the card down to a PSA 9. So I, again, kind of understand PSA's logic here, because the idea is that you can kind of see this. Is it really the biggest deal? No. Assuming all else is good with the card, no hollow lines, no scratches, beautifully crisp borders, I can see it getting a PSA 10. Now, let's briefly take a look at a 75-25, and you can kind of see the territory we're entering now, where the card is pretty significantly skewed in one direction, and obviously this would never receive a PSA 10 or even a BGS 10. And finally but not least, here's a 10x90. So this card, I wouldn't even call this card off-centered, I would actually call this card miscut. This card looks like it was shifted during the cutting process, and as a result, the blades did not line up properly, because in just a little bit more shift, it would have actually clipped the main part of the card off. So do bear that in mind as you see various things play out and various card packs get opened, that the centering can vary a little bit on PSA 10s, BGS is a little bit more strict. Now let's briefly take a look and highlight some of the other things here. For a PSA 9, you can have 65-35 on the front. For a PSA 8, it needs to be 70-30. For a PSA 7, it can be 75-25. Remember that 90-10 quote-unquote miscut card? The earliest you might see a card like that get in with the high standard is about a PSA 3. So you'd need to have a PSA 3 and you could have that severely miscut off-centered card. Now, with Beckett, you'll notice that things are a little bit more stringent. As I'd mentioned, the BGS 10 is a perfectly centered 50-50 card. A Gem Mint BGS is going to be 50-50 in one direction and 55-45 in the other. So basically perfectly centered with just the slightest shift one way or the other. A BGS 9 will have at least one 55-45, and then let's just go down this list super quickly. You'll see that for a BGS 7, it needs to have 65-35, which is actually the centering criteria for a PSA 9. So I'm not going to walk through every single example, but you can see in terms of centering, a BGS 7 equals a PSA 9, and that's actually pretty staggeringly scary. You can see now why a lot of people may favor PSA over BGS in certain instances, especially if a card is otherwise Gem Mint and would get a PSA 10 but wouldn't necessarily get a BGS 10. You can also see why certain BGS cards are very highly valued, because the standards for centering kind of keep the riffraff cards out of the stock and therefore out of the population of those cards. Now friends, with that said, the one last thing to talk about is the off-centered demarcator. Off-centered basically means for PSA, you can submit cards and check the qualifiers box, and if your card is a qualified card, it will receive the 9 OC. Basically what that means is that it would have gotten the other grade if it wasn't for being off-centered. And all that means to say is that you didn't quite make the cut with the centering, but everything else was where it needed to be at. One of the cool things with this OC business is that it's very hard to get nowadays, but a lot of people are actually looking for cards like this, and part of the reason for that is because there are so few of them. So bear in mind that if you ever do get an OC card, you shouldn't necessarily always take it as a bad thing. It may end up being quite the rarity. Now friends, with that said, thanks again for checking out today's video. As a quick aside, we hit 400 subscribers as of the making of this video, so thank you all, each and every single one of you, for your support. I did want to be transparent, so here's also a little snip from my analytics page on the channel. Views are up, watch time is up, so thank you all so much for your support. I really appreciate it. my hope is to continue to do great content. I do realize I skipped last week, Saturday, July 4th. I just threw an opening on instead of this video. It took me a while to get this video out because I really wanted to make sure it was high quality. So I hope you all appreciate today's video. And if you're either coming from a different hobby or you're new and just seeing me for the first time, thank you again for checking me out. I appreciate each and every single one of you, so thank you again for your viewership. Let me know down below, friends. We just hit 400 subscribers, so what vintage set are we opening up next? I know I have fossil packs. It looks like you guys really liked my last mail day video, so I appreciate the support, but let me know, is there another set you want to see opened? I'm going to pick one of those random suggestions and go ahead and open up those packs as soon as I can get them to celebrate 400 subs. So make sure to do that. Make sure to like this video if you like what you saw or learned something new. Thank you again for checking me out, and we'll see you real soon. Peace.